Welcome, everybody. As part of Springfield Technical Community College's celebration of Black History Month, we'd like to welcome you all to today's panel discussion of the Civil Rights Amendment and the Civil Rights Act, an event supported by the STIC Anti-Racism and Inclusion Alliance, and made possible by the School of Liberal and Professional Studies. I'm Stephen Nelson, Chair of STIC's Humanities Department. I'll be acting as the moderator today. I'm joined by two members of STIC's History Department, John Diffley and Dr. J. Anthony Guillory. John Diffley is a professor of history, as well as a coordinator of the Liberal Arts and General Studies program and the honors program here at STIC. He holds a master's degree in history and a JD from Western New England School of Law. He is a member of the Massachusetts Bar. In addition to his role as adjunct professor here at STIC, Dr. Guillory is a history lecturer and advisor to the Africana Studies minor at the University of North Texas. He holds a PhD in African American Studies from UMass Amherst and is working on a second PhD in history from the University of Texas at Arlington. We have reserved time at the end of today's discussion for questions from the audience, so please feel free to submit any questions through the chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. We're going to begin our talk with the Civil Rights Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. And to provide some historical context for our conversation, I would ask John and Anthony to give some background to those amendments.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, Anthony, if you want to jump in. I mean, the Civil Rights Amendments come after the Civil War. They are attempts to, in many ways, grant citizenship rights to African Americans, the freed slaves, is where we're starting. Anthony, if you want to.
Yeah, so I'm going to introduce just a framework through which to view these amendments, this history. Like John said, this is post-Civil War. We are entering into the stage known as Reconstruction, right? It has several manifestations, but for me, right, in the way in which I would argue this if I was presenting this in the class, right, is to view the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment within the larger history of the United States and what's happening, right, as the country is trying to reconcile what just happened, thinking about, right, the players involved, not just African Americans, right, not just the state, right, but particularly people within the state, right, particularly the Republican members of Congress that are anxious to reconstruct the South, right, to bring the country back in order, but they also have great misgivings about what just took place, treason, right, or what they perceive to be treason, right, what they perceive to be terrorism, right, and what they see to be perceived to be as the pursuit of selfish greed and self-interest by the part of what became the Confederate States, right? So that's what I would say would be important to note as far as context.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. You're going to find Anthony and I have a lot of the same takes on this as well. So you want to start? We'll start with the 13th Amendment, the first one coming out of the these are collectively, they're often called the Civil Rights Amendments, sometimes called the Reconstruction Amendments, as Anthony mentioned there. First one's the 13th Amendment, which is the abolition of slavery. It's the first time the word slave is actually used in the Constitution, even though slavery had been part of the country from the very beginning. This is the first time it's in there. And its goal was to end slavery throughout the country. But it doesn't completely outlaw it. We were just talking about this, Anthony, not long ago. It doesn't fully outlaw slavery. And how is that? There's carve out. There's still a carve out for some form of slavery, for forced labor in the Constitution still. It's
yeah, you look at the rhetoric, right? And so the language says, right, I think it's involuntary servitude, right? Slavery and involuntary servitude, except for punishment of a crime.
Yes.
Right. And so regardless of, where we think the country is headed, right, and we can get to that, right, in terms of framing this narrative, there were still a number of people that thought it was completely permissible if you were convicted of a crime, and you are now under the jurisdiction of the state, that you can be forced to do what they consider to be essential labor, right, against your will. Bear in mind that in addition to reconstructing the South, we're trying to bring the South into the modern era, right, of American industrialization, right? We have railroads, right? We have infrastructure, and we need somebody to do that labor, and we need somebody to do it very cheaply, right? And with the 13th Amendment, we just, with the residual impact of the Emancipation Proclamation, and then with the 13th Amendment, right, we have just gotten rid of, right, our cheapest form of labor, right? And so you can see how this is immediately something that can work to the advantage, right, of not only the South, but just to the federal government. To the federal government also. So, yeah, that caveat there, that except for punishment of a crime, right, is important, because it will then impact the way in which, right, Southerners will then strategize to bring the South back as closely as they can to the institution of slavery that preceded the Civil War.
Yeah, and you see that in the black codes in the South. You see it in others. I mean, some places, if you're an African-American male, you had to walk around with papers proving that you're gainfully employed. If not, you could be arrested, put on labor gangs and things like that. And yet there's a long history of them, of sheriffs and others in the South using this labor force to build. I mean, you could even see some of the residuals of this today, some would argue, in the private prison system that goes along, right? It's a for-profit system, and in very much the same way, it's cheap labor, as you mentioned. It's not cheaper than there's no labor cheaper than forced labor, right? And you're not getting paid for it. And so it still is used. I mean, you see this as, this is one of the problems we're going to talk about, I'm sure, as we go through. But of you can have all these acts and amendments, but you still have to deal with the legal system, right? Or the how it can be used against certain people, the disparities in prisons, people in prison. It really does. It's really does end up offering the South a way to bring the South closer to slavery as it was before. And I think that is part of one of the stories of the South after the Reconstruction and the Civil War, is really that goal to get back to it. I mean, we even talked about with the peonage system, essentially sharecropping and things like that are similar. It might not be forced labor, but it's still very cheap labor that
well, it can very much become forced labor, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, with that, let's go back to the Black codes first of all, right? So the Black codes were created shortly after emancipation, right? But they were created simply to criminalize perceived Black behavior, right? And so, have this formerly enslaved population. One of the first things that they're going to do as they become free people is they're going to get out and they're going to search for loved ones. Well, they're not working, right? And so they can be, charged with crimes associated with not working, right? Like vagrancy, right? Today it's called loitering, right? But basically not work, right? Another way in which African Americans will express themselves in their newfound liberty, right, is African American women will leave the fields, they'll leave white kitchens, and they'll go work in their own homes, right? And a police officer will come around, right, checking people's houses, and similar to these, the papers that you mentioned, right, which is reminiscent of apartheid South Africa. Bear in mind which one came first and who got the idea from who. But if women are found in their own homes, in their own kitchens, they say you're not working. Of course, these women are going to say, the hell I'm not. I'm definitely working. I'm in my own home though, right? Well, they would be charged, right, with vagrancy. Right. When we talk convict leasing, right, particularly the narrative that was brought forth by Douglas Blackman in Slavery by Another Name, there's a tendency to focus on men who are exploited by this convict leasing system, right, and the exploitation of the Black, right, but women, right, suffered also, right, and it's largely because they refuse to work in white domestic spaces, right, but nevertheless they're charged, they're poor, right, and so then they have to go to jail, and once they're in jail, right, now that except for punishment of a crime caveat comes into play, right? Can you talk about the convict leasing system and how it took on another?
Yeah, so I mean, the convict lease, and often when these people are put in prison, right, they're sentenced for a bit. One thing that quickly came about is their sentences did not end from what the court first handed down. There were all sorts of ways. It was very a loose system in many ways for people to be added on, right? And so that all of a sudden you would find these sentences stretching on longer and longer as the system is needed. And so essentially what the leasing system is the state leasing out their prisoners to private companies and to build infrastructure and other things, again, pretty much creating a incredibly cheap labor force, right? And then one that is in a bondage still in many ways.
Sure.
And
then like, so to the point about the sharecropping, right? And become forced labor. So sharecropping was a system of agriculture predicated on this idea that the freed people would borrow a tract of land, probably supplies, right? And they would agree to work that land with those supplies, right? And then cultivate a crop. And then they would then share a portion of the crop, right, with the landowner, and that became their payment, right? And that was supposed to cover, right, their housing, right, you know, their food, right, and then their operation costs. But those prices, right, that, you know, that they used to create these contracts were based on like market speculation. Yeah. So something happens and there was, you know, failure in the crop production, right, or you know, there was an overproduction of the crop and prices plummeted, right? When then that meant that these people didn't have as much money or could not yield as much money, right, to then pay back whatever it is that they lost. Right. Yeah. And then that would then mean that they're now on the hook for whatever that difference would be. And they're forced to work that land and forced to work longer until they can pay off, right, that debt. Now, obviously, these things can be exploited, right? But just to say they don't, and there is just a simple issue of, you know, the market crashes, right? Well, then they're forced to work that land. And if they, for whatever reason, leave, then they can go to jail.
Yeah.
Right.
And the debt follows.
So they would have to, you know, yeah. So like this concept of stealing oneself away or running away, right, persists even beyond slavery, because in many cases, right, there are African Americans that are facing such tremendous amount of debt, right, the peonage system and so forth, as it's operationalized in the South, that they will end up having to run away and just relocate, right, completely. So, you know, there is an issue there. And then, you know, one of the things that I think is important to think about with the convict leasing system is it's not something that we know very much about now. Douglas Blackman is probably a very wealthy man now because he did, you know, some field investigation there in Alabama, right? But the thing is, this was very well-known information while it was happening. Somehow we've done a really, really good job of covering this up. But the convict leasing system, we need to understand, right, expands from the late 19th century up to like the 1940s. And the reason why it finally goes away is because other countries know that we're doing the convict leasing system, and it becomes a tool of propaganda that can be used by the Japanese, right, in our imperial war, right? And so that's when we finally get rid of it. But it's a huge system. It's a very, very successful system, right? And we owe the modernization of the South to this system.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah, it definitely is. And those one of the other thing with the sharecropping too is those debts would go for generations too. It would pass on. So you have people essentially tied to the land. I mean, it's you know, in Europe you had serfdom where you have families for generations upon generations tied to a lord. You know, that it's very similar. That's why they use the term peonage in many ways. It's very reminiscent of that. And yeah, the price and the economics of it. There were going to be market crashes, overproduction, you know, the English are producing more and more cotton in India and Egypt, flooding the market there. And so it is going to set them back. And as you said, too, one thing, so if you needed equipment, you'd have to go it through the landlord as well, right? Through their own shops. And you know, you're not getting fair prices there. Right. I mean, there are stories of them even being charged upon debt, people being charged upon debt for the nails used for their coffins and adding onto their, literally, and then adding onto their debt. Right. And then that gets passed down. It's totally an impressive system, to say the least there. Just to keep things moving, maybe we should talk about the 14th Amendment moving forward there. Right. Sure. So the 14th Amendment, the goal of this was the next one there was to grant the former slave citizenship. Right. Is really the goal there. Because up to this point in the Constitution, they're not fully considered citizens. Right. Or I believe the term is other persons at times. Is that what that's what it's used there? And so they are granted citizenship through this. It's meant to you know, give them equal protection of laws, privilege and immunities, but citizenship, saying anybody anybody born in the United States is now a citizen, right? And to ensure that, and as Rick's saying, it's the first time you start actually applying this to the states. And because that's what it pretty much does originally. That's why in some ways the 14th Amendment has is one of the more important amendments because it's been used in so many ways and incorporates all the other amendments, applies them to states. But even at that, there's going to be challenges. It doesn't just solve all the issues. Yes, they're considered citizens, but is that, what is the guarantee there? And we'll see that it's there is no guarantee for this. But
yeah,
Anthony,
so there's two takeaways that I have here. So, and this takes us back, right, into the early 19th century. So as the slave states and non-slave holding states are jockeying for political power, right, in Washington, you have what's known as the creation of slave power, or right, the increased strength and representation among the slave holding states, because they're able to count not only their white population towards representation, but they're able to count their non-white population towards representation. But this gives us, this brings in this 3/5 clause, right? So a person, one non-white person is worth 0.6, right, or 60% of a white person, right? And so what that does, though, is that increased, right, number towards representation gives Southern states or slaveholding states tremendous amount of political power, right? There's a wave of migration from Europe into northern states, largely because of the institution of slavery, right? And we have more time, we can unpack that, right? But many of these European groups are coming into northern states. And by the 1840s, right, there seems to be like, a balance, if you will, because of the increased representation that has been brought about with European migration. Well, so anyway, we go through the Civil War, 13th Amendment is ratified, right? And then now we have the 14th Amendment, which says that everybody, right, everyone that is born in the United States is now a citizen, right? So now that person, right, so let's say there are 4 million African Americans in the South at the end of the Civil War, right? Well, under the 3/5 clause, that would be, right, 2.4 million people counted towards additional people counted towards representation. But following the Civil War, right, and especially with the ratification of the 14th Amendment, now that's 4 million people counted towards representation, right? So the strength of the South at the federal level in Washington, right, has this huge uptick, right? And so I think it's important to note that, because there are two other clauses within the 14th Amendment that seek to punish the South. One of them, right, says that just those who have who are leaders of the South, who swore an oath of office, right, or leaders in Congress swore an oath in office, right, but then they engaged in rebellion or insurrection. It punishes them, right? But it also says, right, another part of the 14th Amendment is that those people who lost property, including the property held in enslaved people, right, will not be able to recoup, right, those losses. Right, so this is important. Right? We don't really talk about this much when we're talking about the 14th Amendment, right? But it looks like you can look at this whole thing either in part or in full, right, as a way to further stymie, right, the ability for white Southerners who participated in the Confederacy to regain control economically or politically.
But as we know right from the beginning, I mean, there's a wave of white terrorism and others, from the Ku Klux Klan to all these other groups. You have the Colfax, one of the worst massacres, Colfax Massacre in 1872. There's violence all across the South here. And so they are not, we quickly find that it's not really punishing them in many ways. And they're going to quickly, if they lose that, in some places, they actually overthrow elected state legislatures and elected state officials, let alone also assassinating in broad daylight many times African Americans, white allies, Republicans, anybody. And so this is a targeted system of terror, going after voters, everybody, even with the occupying forces there. I mean, they're fighting back.
And I think that'll play an important role when we get towards the end of this thing. And I think that, again, but I introduced that, right, as a way of talking about, okay, all right, well then, what is the significance of this amendment, right? Is it, again, as we often talk about it, right, is this should we focus on, right, the fact that it gives African American citizenship, right, or, right, is there a larger context into which that we need to frame this thing or understand this thing? And the reason why I raise that is, like I said, going back to what I said earlier about the way in which we frame this. We frame the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, initial Civil Rights Act, right, as this moment where I heard one text, I remember one textbook saying, right, was putting America on its its rightful path, right, its rightful destiny, as if we're moving, right, as if there is this universal sense of progression, right, and we have all bought into it, at least for this moment in time, right. And then we didn't talk about the amendments, and in the aftermath we talk, or in hindsight we talk about them as the unfulfilled promise. And like I said, I challenge that narrative. And hopefully that becomes clear as we continue our conversation, because I'm not sold on the idea that there was this vacuum in history in which all these assumptions that we made previously and all these assumptions that were held by Northerners as well as Southerners, right, simply cease and desist, at least for a moment in time, right, only to resume, to resume less than 20 years later, right, with just as much ferocity, right, and terror as what preceded it. So anyway, that's my take on that one.
Yeah, and one of the things too is a historian that we both admire, Eric Foner, has talked about this, is that talking about challenging that idea that there's this path towards progress and democracy, that he would point out the undemocratic norms and history that's been throughout the country there, going back to the originally founding of the country, but especially in this Reconstruction era limiting people's rights there, and so it is not guaranteed. I mean, even from the beginning, you have the slaughterhouse cases in 1873. This begins to chip away at the 14th Amendment almost immediately, right? It says that it defines fundamental rights, but does it? That's the only thing protected, but it's incredibly vague, right? So one of them, the right to make a living without being burdened by going to a separate slaughterhouse, not a core right. So essentially laying the groundwork for segregation in many ways, saying it does not truly protect all of these there. And so that it can quickly, the Supreme Court is going to say that laws like this do not violate either the 13th or 14th Amendment. It's really putting limitations on the federal power to protect any of this there.
Absolutely.
And
that's what gives me pause about how we should view this, right? Because immediately, right, the federal government, right, through the Supreme Court, is taking a hands-off approach to the ways in which African Americans are left to fend for themselves in the South, right? Where in which we leave, right, actual civil rights, right, and the protection thereof to the states, right, knowing full well, right, that there are many, there are many white factions in most of the Southern states that are immediately involved in the
White League, the red shirts,
subjugating African Americans, right, that are trying to smoke out and then execute, right, whites who are either part of the Republican Party or whites who have come from northern spaces and they're perceived as exploiters, right?
Carpetbaggers.
This is immediate, right? So if the and here's my question: if the goal was to create a racial democracy, which is what we like to think, if that was the goal, then how can you have such a complete about face so quickly after these amendments were not only introduced but then ratified? That would be my question.
Yeah, and it's a great, I mean, it's really from the very beginning here. I mean, you have the civil rights cases in 1883 holds that Congress didn't have the authority to prohibit racial discrimination. So again, as you're saying there, it seems to be doing the exact opposite, right? You have these amendments, but then you get them applied, and how they're enforced is the complete opposite, and seems to undo just about everything that was at least attempted there. Steve said, I give a general stance to the two parties at the time. The parties were different. You had the Democratic Party in the South and in the North. The Democratic Party in the South had been the party of the slaveholders previously, before, and white supremacists. They had Republicans are in the North at this point. But even there, you have factions within them challenging this, right? You have the radical Republicans who want to push things further. Anthony, you want to?
For more research on, or more information about the Republican Party, look at Eric Foner's research, and which he talks about like the Free Soiler Party, which is Lincoln's original party, and they come out of what we call the Northwest Territories, right, which was a group of free states, right, just what we now call the Upper the important political platform point for the Free Soiler Party is we want no African Americans in the country at all, right? So no, we don't want slavery, right? But we don't want free African Americans either, because we don't want to have to compete against African American labor, right? Taking for granted that because African Americans face race discrimination, right, and because they're inclined to not only be offered but then to receive or accept lower wages, we don't want to have to compete against that, right? And they thought that slavery was just an even worse, right, issue for economic competition. And so they
the
are
free labor ideology, as it becomes known as. Sorry, the free labor ideology. That should be the core. Yeah.
Right. And so, so Lincoln's initial position is, African Americans should be freed, but then they should be removed or exiled from the country.
Colonization attempts, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so, that is one of the more important factions that make up the Republican Party. Right. And so among them, though, right, and this is the group that has, in hindsight, right, these have been given the most attention. There are a group of anti-racist, right, Republicans who want to do the work of not only freeing enslaved African Americans, right, but then making them full citizens, right, and then giving them access, right, to the same, rights, privileges, and resources that white Americans are able to enjoy, right. And that's the group that we tend to, to favor, right, when we talk about this period, right. But we need to understand they were merely one faction,
a small
and they
faction,
weren't the loudest, and they weren't the loudest, right. Even the one that even someone that we would look at, right, like William Lloyd Garrison. If you look at Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi, he talks about William Lloyd Garrison as being almost like a lifelong, right, assimilationist, right. So Kendi's going to take the view that assimilationist, reform is racist in scope, because it suggests that there's something wrong with African Americans and that they can become more like white people.
They need to change, right? They need to assimilate into white American culture.
Absolutely. But in that context, he himself, right, is a radical, right, because he thinks that African Americans can be assimilated at all, right. But even someone like William Lloyd Garrison will take the position after the 15th Amendment that the work of the federal government in putting the Negro on par with with whites is done, right. And so he's like, hey, do it, right? Go make it happen, right? And so these factions, though, we need to understand, right? Like even the most radical among them, right? Again, they're very small in scope, but those who are more numerous, who are engaged in the work of these Reconstruction Acts and who are engaged in this early work to try to protect African American citizenship, right? Ability to choose their own labor, right? Where they live and so forth. And then of course the right to vote for African American men, right? They're doing so, right? They're doing so in a way that is not indicative of what we think is happening, right? They're doing so in a way that seems tempered. And they certainly have, and their patience certainly has a shelf life.
Yes.
Right?
The whole
and I think that it's important to
patience
understand that. Yeah, and I think it's important to understand that their patience has a shelf life. And so if we're talking about, this is the goal is creating a racial democracy, we need to understand why even William Lloyd Garrison would have, right, such a short fuse for patience when he's saying, okay, all right, we're done. We've done what we needed to do.
Yeah, and then it should just it's
speaking of democracy. Oh, sorry, John. Speaking of democracy, so part of that involves getting in and actually participating in that democratic process.
Body politic, right?
And so I'm going to use that as a segue to move into the 15th Amendment, if you guys don't mind.
Yes.
Yeah, totally.
No, that's fine. So the 15th Amendment, the last of the Civil Rights Amendment, the goal here was to give African-American males voting rights in this, regardless of race. And it is important to know that it's African-American males only at this point. It is not women. And that was it, but it doesn't have as much enforcement ability in it, I would argue, that's written in the Constitution. As we know, states set their own voting, ways of voting. And this is even going to be challenged right from the beginning as well, where they're going to allow states to set these rules for who and who cannot vote there. And so it is, again, it gives part of the population the right to vote, but as we know, it still doesn't go very far to actually enforcing that right to vote. It states it that they have it. But
sure. Yeah, I think that's important to note for all of these, right? An amendment is not a law.
Yeah.
An amendment, there still needs to be laws written.
Yes.
Right. And so this is how you can have, these, ridiculous statistics, right, where slavery did not actually end in 1865, but somewhere like backwoods Tennessee, right, that was considered reconstructed very early, right, or in places like Kentucky, right, that was also, right, a slaveholding state, but that was part of the, the border, right, where slavery persisted like almost to like 1870, because nobody bothered to go and check to see if people actually holding other people in bondage, right? They didn't actually do it. But with the 15th Amendment, my take here, right, is a bit a bit controversial, because what we see happening on the ground, but also in our conversation about it after the fact, is that there are both. So there are African American women and men, there are white women and men who are involved in this pursuit of the 15th Amendment, and there are women who are suffragists who are saying, okay, this is an opportunity to not only create a racial democracy, but also to create, right, a democracy that is free from racial discrimination as well as gender discrimination. But we don't take it that far, right?
It's not their moment.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's this conversation happening, and there's a set of gender politics that play on the ground, and we use those primary sources, right, to help us, frame what happened. Right. I forget who it was. I think it was Frederick Douglass that said something to the effect that this is the Negro's hour.
Yes.
Right. The woman has to wait. The Negro presupposing that all Negroes are male and that all women are white. But
and that women have been a large part of the abolition movement as well. And so many of them expected that this was and viewed it as a larger fight, not just as limited as Douglass and others hold it as.
Absolutely. But bear with me while I propose that this is not what's happening.
Okay.
I don't think this is an opportunity where we just simply fell short. I think that the radical Republicans had a particular goal in mind, and it was to neutralize those whites in the South who had been recently readmitted into the Union and who had been reinstated into the body politic, so much so that many of these people had regained or retaken or reclaimed their positions of power, right, in the state as well as at the federal level. Okay. So again, going back to this 3/5 clause, once they're freed, that 2.4 million becomes 4 million, right, towards representation. Okay, there's no way for the northern states or the non-slaveholding states to ever regain, right, anything resembling that, especially within that short period of time. But the Republicans in the North want to maintain control. Okay, so then what do we do? Okay, all right, well, those African Americans are now, 1 for 1, right, towards representation, right? We need to figure out a way. Speaking as these Republicans, we need to figure out a way to neutralize that white vote, that white male vote in the South. Well, how do we do it? If we give everybody the right to vote, well, what is that going to do?
Well, you're gonna have white, the slave owner, the Confederates.
Who are white women going to vote? Who are white women going to vote for? Right, white women in the South, right? Are we gonna? Do we think that white women in the South are going to vote a bunch of African Americans in the office? Hell no. So. Okay, all right. So again, that's not the goal, right? I would argue that's not the goal. I think the goal was to neutralize the white Southern vote, and there was a political calculation made. If we give Black men the right to vote, I bet you they will not vote the same as white Democratic leaders in the South. And so at best, they will cancel each other out, and Republicans in the North can continue to run Washington.
Yes.
And that's precisely what happened.
Yeah, no, it is. In many ways, it really is. I mean, you say it's controversial, but you make a lot of good points there. That it's so there's always other motivations going on. It is about political power, right? As you said, it's not all the factions are all for this, as we saw. And they are interested in their own political power in many ways, and almost above anything else.
We can talk about it as the end of the racial. We can talk about a racial democracy and the failure of the racial democracy, but I don't know that was their goal. So can we call it a failure? Right. We can talk about it as the failure of the egalitarian democracy, right? That sees no discrimination on the basis of gender or race. But I don't know that that was their goal, right? It was an opportunity, but it wasn't one that they were looking for. Right. So I don't know that it's even fair to view it as that. It was just as racist and just as sexist as it had been, is my argument. Right. But there was a way in which, right, race could be manipulated for their political advantage. And I think that's exactly what they did.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. One other thing, it's just we're going forward here, but we talked about, the need for enforcement and all of this too. It's just one thing to note is that you have these 3 amendments in the 1860s, right after the Civil War. By 1870, 71, you have, because again, they're just amendments, but you need laws, as you said, you have the Enforcement Acts, a series of 3 laws passed the federal government. And what are they there to enforce? Is try to enforce some of these rights there. They're meant to go after the Ku Klux Klan and others. But the problem is the federal government doesn't have the ability to enforce these at this point. One of the things weeks later after the Enforcement Acts are created, Congress creates the Department of Justice, which are, creates an attorney general for the federal government and gives them oversight of all U.S. attorneys, marshals, and President Grant at the time tries to use this to go after the KKK, go after some of these groups there. And there are lots of indictments and things like that, but the punishment is, so for lynching, the most punishment people get for these assassinations, maybe 5 years in prison would be the maximum there. Doesn't seem like a punishment fitting the crime either there, but very quickly, even the Colfax Massacre of 1872, eventually you get in a United States Supreme Court a case, United States versus Cruikshank, that finds that the intent of the defendants by their conspiracy was not to murder African Americans and others. Essentially, flying in the face of what is, it seems obvious to others, holds that Congress can't abridge the right of assembly. And so it doesn't apply. The Enforcement Acts and those civil rights don't apply to, some of these groups who are seemingly overthrowing, fairly elected individuals. And it even goes further and says and this is from the court case, that the federal government only had the right to prohibit the violations of Black rights in states only, did not hold the power for punishing criminal acts committed by individuals in those states, and leaves it to the local authorities. So what it's saying is that you could have a civil case if for lynching, for assassination, things like that, but the feds cannot, prosecute these cases. It's going to fall to the state and local courts, and oftentimes some of these people are involved in it, or they're not enforcing these rights at all. And so it's it's again, it really does show that you really need to go further. But at this point, you're getting towards where, as you said, that people are, it's like almost there's a moral stagnation. People are tired of this, right? They're ready to move on in the North and others. The interest in pursuing, you have occupation in the South, you have Grant, sends out the army to hunt out and drive the KKK underground and things like that. But how long is that going to last? And once they leave, we know what happens. Is it all comes back? Is it really? And it comes back in. Then you get the Jim Crow laws, segregation and all that. This is so again, one thing I would say is it's really about the willingness to follow through in all of this, and how much sometimes force, Eric Foner has said this, sometimes a force has to be used to protect some of these things, and it's not always, people are not always willing to do this. And it really did in many ways give a green light for all of this to happen, and for states not to enforce their these laws.
Absolutely. Yeah, the southern states were already looking for ways to manipulate these amendments.
Mm-hmm.
And once they saw that their acts of terror were going to go unpunished, right? When they could lynch people in the middle of the street, and no one sees jail time.
Nobody.
Right. Or if there is, if someone is brought up on charges, right, and they are tried, right, the jury selected will be an all-white jury that will not convict them, right? And so it's just it does unleash for many of these people, right, this agency, right, to just to do as they feel they must, right, to recapture what they feel is lost, lost supremacy, lost power, right, in the aftermath of the Civil War. And what's interesting is that you see that this terror, this white terror, it spans beyond class lines. I get why the white politician doesn't want a Black politician, right, in office. I totally get that, right? I get why the white business owner or white grocery store owner doesn't want a Black grocery store owner to open up shop, right, in a similar vicinity, right? You understand it. But then the question becomes, well, then why are these poor whites so heavily involved in this work? Why are poor whites buying into this narrative, right, of white supremacy? Why are poor whites buying into this idea that the African American freed from slavery is not only lazy, but also like a socially moral, socially, sexually, and morally degenerate, right? Why? What do they have invested in this system, right, that would want them to perpetuate something like that, right? And then I think that to that we need to look at someone like W.B. Du Bois, or even later on, David Roediger, who talk about this concept of the wage of whiteness, right? Where in which these poor whites, right, who have been just as marginalized economically, if not politically, right? They're also not landowners. They're also being exploited, right? They're also the most impacted by, the fall of the South, right? And the political and economic instability. And they have an opportunity to, to form alliances with African Americans. And you do see some, right? Some examples, right? The Populist Party, right? There's a time when the Populists will have an interracial coalition, right? The Farmers Alliance here in Texas will have some type of, right, interracial coalition, right? But it doesn't last very long, right? And it's very easy for Southern politicians, right, to convince poor whites to act against their economic self-interest, right, in favor of this mythological racial self-interest, right, to then perpetuate these acts, right? And so these, these acts of terror committed, the reason why they can happen so publicly, right, and the reason why, you can have a whole town, right, is because you have buy-in from the whole community, poor and otherwise, right? And because they're, these white leaders in the South are able to convince these poor whites, right, that the struggle is, literally black and white, right? Or African American versus white, and that they must play a role, or else it will then bring about their own demise. Never mind the fact that they're also sharecroppers. Never mind the fact that they're also tenant farmers, right? And they're also being adversely affected by, right, agricultural policies, right, the Gilded Age and so forth, right? And so it's interesting to think about, but I think it's important that we note, right, that this is these acts of terror, right, and this commitment to, right, the subjugation through violence of African Americans, right, as well as their allies, right. It spans beyond, right, all the different economics, all the economic levels among whites in the South, because there's something, right, mythological that they think that they're trying to protect, and I think that's huge to note.
Yeah, no, there is much. Also, it's like psychological, as Deacon Rickle mentions in there. It's a part of this too. Is for even though sharecroppers, white sharecroppers, right? They're still never going to be the bottom of the ladder. There, they're never going to be the bottom. That had psychological power over people. They could, no matter how poor, they could be dirt farmers too, but they are not the bottom of the social system or economic system. And that is literally how sometimes it was argued to them, right? Yes, this might hurt you, but you're still not black. You're not a former slave. Yeah, exactly. No, really, that's what they would argue. And also you mentioned the populist too, Tom Watson, who was really a proponent early in his life of interracial action. You said that people grow a shelf life to it, right? He goes on and becomes a virulent racist afterwards, right? After the failures of some of this, and instead of he blames African Americans. That's his takeaway from all this, right? It's not that there's other things. It's African Americans are somehow undermining this, and so it's the psychological impact is not to be underestimated. I really do think that. I mean, and in all of this, just to move along to the Civil Rights Act, again, sort of reinforcing what we're saying, been saying here, is that flash forward almost 100 years, 1964. There's still a need for civil rights acts, right? There were civil rights acts actually passed in 1875, which the Supreme Court actually tosses out. There's other ones before this in the 20th century that do very little, and actually, they're very limited in scope. And so then you have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which tries to enforce constitutional rights, including the right to vote, jurisdiction for district courts, trying to stop discrimination, things like that. But it only goes so far in that. And Anthony, if you want to jump in on the Civil Rights Act there.
Yeah, so this, the Civil Rights Act 64, right, serves to undermine or continue to eat away at Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, that decreed that separate but equal accommodations for African Americans and whites was permissible. One of the strategies that I think is more important, even more important, that the NAACP employed when they went after segregation in 1954 during Brown, is preceding that. They literally went around from state to state and pointed out all the ways in which institutions that claim to be separate and equal were not. Right? And once they exposed that, right, and took it to the court, right, then the states were having, they were forced, right, either at the local level or at the state level, they were forced to create these equal accommodations. And so,
Yes.
Let's say there's one Black family, right? They have 2 little kids, right? Well, the little kids can't go swim in the pool, in the white pool, right? Well, the NAACP finds out about this when now the town has to build a separate pool, right? And of course they don't want to do that, and they probably don't even have the funds to do that, right? The more, the other cases, right, involve education, right, where they're African Americans that want to go to grad school. There's no Black grad school provided for them. They're not able to go.
Or when they did create the law school at, I think it's University of Texas, right? It was, they gave him a basement office and no law library, nothing like this. It's but that's equal. It was the argument is, look, they have, he's admitted to law school, so.
Right. There's some states were paying for Black students to go to school outside the state, right? But of course that just becomes too expensive, right? Speaking of the University of Texas Law School, right, we now have what's known as Texas Southern. Those of you who are Beyonce fans, right, she talks about Texas Southern quite a bit. Texas Southern was created as a last-ditch effort to try to keep UT Austin from being desegregated. We had already had Prairie View A&M, which is the Black version of Texas A&M, right? We had already had a number of other Black colleges, right? But for whatever reason, the University of Texas was able to stay, right? Was able to preserve its lily white image, right? But then there was a movement here in Texas. My former professor, Milkar Shabazz, has a book called Advancing Democracy, where in which he shows that there's a group of African Americans and white allies here in Texas that are mobilizing to go at desegregation, right? And then, like I said, as a last ditch effort, well beyond, right, the point when they had a chance to fight for this. The state of Texas allocates money for the creation of TSU there in Houston. And that was their way of trying to, appease those who wanted to go to the University of Texas Law School. But nevertheless, the NAACP, before they go after, right, the idea that this, separate but equal is unjust or immoral, right? They go first and demonstrate the ways in which separate and equal is not being enforced, right? And then from, beyond that, right, I think it's important to note that we have the Executive Order 9981, right, by Truman, which desegregates the armed forces in 1948, right? We have Montgomery, bus boycotts in 55, right? And it's during that period that some people call that, they say that this is the start of the civil rights movement, which I think is a little, no, I think it's very inaccurate, because there's never been a time when African Americans weren't protesting for their rights. It's just 1955 is when Dr. King shows up. But nevertheless, right, when we get to 1960, the election of John F. Kennedy, he has this reputation, right? He has this like rock star, right, image. And for whatever reason, despite, his platform, many African Americans believe that he's going to be their candidate. And so they go out in droves to support him, right? Many of them felt like they got him elected, right? And so they immediately, at the proletariat level, right, the grassroots level, but also among African American leadership, they start pushing Kennedy, right, to create, or to push a civil rights bill, right, and then to sign a civil rights bill into law. But of course, he's adverse to doing that, right? You spoke in this panel. This was probably 8 years at this point. No, it couldn't have been that.
I was thinking about today. I couldn't figure out. I was like, is it really that long ago?
Maybe it was like 5 years ago.
Yeah.
It was early in our tenure that you spoke on a committee where you talked about Kennedy as a cold warrior, right? And how he will then become introduced to civil rights. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, because especially in the Cold War, a lot of, if you looked at the propaganda that the Soviet Union and later China is putting out there, especially in places like Latin America and Africa, it shows that over 50% of their propaganda against the United States was saying, look at how they treat their African American, look at their Black and brown people. What do you think they're gonna do to you here? And so increasingly civil rights, Jim Crow, all these other segregation is looked at as a weapon that weaponized against the United States in this fight against anti-communism, and that begins to push. I mean, Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy as Attorney General, many of them viewed Martin Luther King as a communist plant, right? He's actually part of their conspiracy to overthrow the United States. They wiretap him and others. It's going to take a bit, but I mean, even them, they were. At the time, it's not really till there are larger issues at play, right? As this global domination, do they begin to try to does Kennedy get involved there? But he's looked at as the champion, but it's clearly not the case. In a lot of his early speeches, he is not as supportive as maybe we remember in all of this.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important. You look at someone like Doug McAdams, who's actually a sociologist, but he applies what's known as the political process theory for social movements to the civil rights movement. And he talks about how important it was to have an international audience to disseminate these media images, right? And what he would argue is that the civil rights opponents and activists, right, those who were involved in direct confrontation, right, knew very well how preoccupied Kennedy was with winning the Cold War. And they were also very, very well aware of the role that the Soviets, the Chinese, and then later the Cubans were playing, right, to disseminate these ideas that create, or to disseminate these images that painted the United States in a very, very bad light, right? And they, this is where you see these images, right, where, African Americans are dressed like they going to church, right? And you got little kids outside, and everybody got, little girls got bows in their hair and everything like that. And you just see them getting mowed down by water hoses and so forth, right?
Dog sick.
They were goated, right? Like, this is not just Black people being attacked, right? These were African Americans that said, okay, we know that this is what's going to happen. Right. And so they went to the street knowing full well that this is the attention, or this is the energy they were going to receive. Right. And they did this understanding that, okay, yes, some of us are going to get hurt. Perhaps some of us are going to die. Right. But if we engage in nonviolent direct action and we are met with violence, somebody's going to have a video recorder. Right. And it's amazing. Right. I mean, Grant, this is not the era of social media, but those images spread throughout the world really, really quickly.
Really quickly.
And they were very, very influential.
Yep.
Right. And we need to understand the Cold War, right? Even though the United States and the Soviets, did not engage in, face-to-face combat, right? They fought a number of proxy wars and so forth that extends well into the late 1980s, right? But they themselves did not fight, but it was a war for ideas. And it was very easy, to your point, right, to look and say, hey, look at what they're doing to the Africans that live there. Right. In the case of the Japanese, right, internment camps, look at what they're doing to Asian people in their own country. Right.
Yeah, and the Supreme Court allowed, under the 14th Amendment, allowed Japanese internment. That was perfectly fine under there. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so, as much as, we would love to say, oh, well, Kennedy was the progressive president and he was the civil rights president, right? He was very ambivalent. And I don't think that if this was, I don't think that if this was presented to him in another way, that we would have seen the civil rights bill, right? At least not when we did see it, right? But to your, the question that you would ask me about the Civil Rights Act in terms of like what it did not do, okay? And this is, tell me if this registers, right? So, well, we know that it didn't protect voting, right? We'll have to create a Voting Rights Act, and that'll come in 65. But the Civil Rights Act didn't do two things that I think are really important to help us to understand where we are right now in the United States. It did not protect against police brutality. And it offered no economic justice, no reparations, or no improved housing or economic conditions of African Americans. It did not. And so that's why you can have the Civil Rights Bill, Civil Rights Act of 64, you have the Voting Rights Act of 65, and then you can have riots throughout many urban centers in the United States in 67, right? Because people were saying, okay, but what about us, right? If you were Black and middle class, right? Think about what we're talking about, right? We're saying, okay, I want to go sit at this lunch counter and have a burger. You know what that presupposes, John? That you have money to go eat a burger.
Yes, exactly. Right.
You know what that?
You have the free time to do that.
Presupposes that you can do that, right? You got the money to do that.
Yeah.
Right. But the people, right, who are locatable in what we call urban ghettos, they didn't have money for no burger, John. And so King's message doesn't resonate with them, right? And when he goes to somewhere like Chicago, right, he doesn't get near as much, right? He doesn't have near as much success, not just among the city in general, but with the Black population, because they're like, bro, we don't relate to this, right? They're representing a very different, right, caste and class position, right? And so that's why, but similar to William Lloyd Garrison, right, LBJ, who actually signs the Civil Rights Act, he's okay, well, we've done it. Hey, everybody's, we've solved it, right? Race problem, gone, right?
Yeah. And then Voting Rights Act, it's really nailed it down. Everything's good to go from here on out.
Absolutely.
Problem solved.
But these people in Dallas and Chicago and Detroit and Cleveland and, Watts, LA, they're saying, no, man, we're still going through it. You know, this didn't do
Yes,
anything for us. You know, what are you gonna
Mhm.
do to help us, right?
Yeah.
And I
That's still
mentioned
an issue.
reparations. Because think about all those people between 1896 and 1954 who had set up black towns, all black towns, or they set up certain, segments of towns, and they thrived under separate but equal. They created black institutions, black schools.
Mhm.
They had many black property owners, business owners, right? They had lawyers, doctors, teachers, right?
Okay.
Morticians, right? Beauty salons. And these places were destroyed, right?
Yes.
A couple of weeks ago, I spoke on a panel, right, for the commemoration of the Tulsa race
Tulsa,
riot.
right.
Well, okay, all right. Well, these places were completely destroyed, right? These are people that said, okay, we're going to take for granted, separate but equal. We're going to take for granted that y'all do not view us as, racial,
Mhm.
economic equals or political equals, and we're going to remove ourselves from this, right? And we're going to set up our own autonomous institutions,
Yes.
right? And in many cases, they thrive. Tulsa's one example,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
What happened? Okay, they still breached the white racial status quo, right? They still
Mhm.
upset and threatened white supremacy, right? And in the case of Tulsa, right, they literally flew airplanes and bombed the city.
Bombed them. Yes, literally.
Right? They didn't just shoot up everybody. They literally
No.
bombed these businesses.
This is in America too. This is the United
Absolutely.
States.
This is the
Not
United
that long
States.
ago in reality.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. So it's important to understand that, there's a lot that precedes this. But the Civil Rights Act doesn't do anything to address that.
Nothing. I mean, and that's, even though when you get rid of like the protective, restrictive covenants, right, for a while up until the 1920s, you could put into a contract for the sale of your home, right? It can't be then sold to an Asian, African American, things like that. Okay, so eventually they say you can't have that in there. Doesn't mean there's ways around that. I mean, even where it says you can't discriminate, right? Discrimination is one of the hardest legal things to prove, right? Unless you got someone who says, I am doing this because you are Black or you are this, prove it, right? I mean, most of our, unless you're under a term of employment contract for a term of years, right? Or in a union, you can be fired for any reason, right? Essentially, just don't give a bad reason, a violated one. And so you never have to say this is extraordinarily hard to prove. And people have found ways around it, and they still do. You talk about economics. I mean, it's still a problem. The wealth gap and disparity, criminal justice system. None of this is addressed in that Civil Rights Act. Interesting too. Just note about the Civil Rights Act too. This wasn't like something everybody was on board with too. This is the longest filibuster in history, Senate filibuster in history. 57 days they tried to talk this down and stop the Senate action for 57 days. Took 83 days to get this passed just through the Senate. I mean, that is astonishing. It shows that how many people were, and it wasn't just, often there's a view, it's probably Southerners. Not the case at all that we're opposing this. This is not, no. I mentioned something in the chat there too. This isn't always a Southern problem either, right? We talk about separate but equal. One of the cases cited in Plessy versus Ferguson is a Massachusetts court case from 1850. Roberts, a young girl, had to walk past, I think it was 3 different white schools to get to her school on the other side of the city. State of Massachusetts said, that's fine. That's totally fine. That is cited as precedent and it directly in Plessy and says, look, this is not about laws. This is just the way people feel. This is right. And if it's okay in the North, why can it be wrong in the South? And so this is not something that is just, this is a nationwide issue.
Absolutely. Yeah, and then I think that's important to note, right? Because we talk about the civil rights within the context of the South, right? But police brutality is something that goes through, is problematic throughout the country, right? Economic justice is definitely part of the, an issue there, right? Restrictive covenants, right? Our beloved Bloomfield, Connecticut, is the product of redlining.
Oh God, yeah.
Right. I forget the exact date. I have it. I used to talk about this, but yeah, I want somebody, when y'all are done, Google when Puerto Ricans were able to buy homes in Springfield. Right. So this is not just a Southern phenomenon, right?
Yeah. When was the last time the Springfield Public Schools fought segregation and filed the cases, school board into the 1970s, fighting integration in Springfield, in Massachusetts. I mean, this is, you have the busing riots and things. It's
Right. Be very mindful of
Shocking.
that language. Desegregation is not integration.
Yes.
Okay. And so, look at, I mean, the statistics now suggest, right, that in most cities throughout the country, right, but specifically in the North, right, schools are as segregated as they were before Brown.
Yeah, it's shocking.
So what does that say, right? Now, certainly there's an economic piece to that, right, that we, that we need to discuss, right? But again, but this is definitely one of the limitations, right? And it's primarily because of the lack of an economic piece, right, that we must address this, right? Because we like to call it white flight, right? Well, no, that's not what happened, right? Middle class African Americans left the hood, they left the ghetto, right? And when they left, right, they moved into these predominantly white spaces, and they have their own issues there, right? Being being in a predominantly white space, right? Being one of the only families of color, but nevertheless, they left. Right. And so they might be able to get their kids into, a predominantly white school, right? Or, the creation of a mixed race school, right? But those who were left inside urban, these urban ghettos, they remain segregated. And then, so, I think that's really important to talk about as far as limitations thereof. What is this? Oh, Rick Norman says something about Montgomery, Rosa Parks, right? In the deliberate act of the NAACP to challenge. Challenge.
I think that was a response where you said is it wasn't that the people went out there knowing that they're going to get fire hoses attacking, right? They're egging this on. They understood it. They're not just passive actors, right? This was planned. They knew what they were doing. They knew the power of images, how this could. So I think that's what Norman was getting out there, which he's totally right on that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know. Maybe we should move. I mean, we could talk about this forever. Unfortunately,
No,
this is.
I'm looking at the chat now. Thank y'all for your comments in the chat.
Yes.
Thank you for supporting the conversation and engaging through that. But yeah, let's go to the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Zol.
So if anybody has any questions, you can either put them in the chat. Feel free to unmute yourself. I think that's going to cause chaos, though.
Yeah, put it in the chat and then we can read it.
Raise your hand feature on Zoom.
We do have a raise your hand feature.
Ask it in the chat. Ask the question in the chat.
Yeah, it's probably the best way.
And then Steve, can you read it?
Yeah, I can read them. Once they appear.
Yeah. One thing too with the Voting Rights Act, let me just throw something in there too. I mean, even when you have the Voting Rights Act later, as we've seen, there has been now attempts that's been chipped away at in the past decade too. And right after you start seeing the mid 2010s, you see all these states in the South and other places, and I think there was a comment about this in the chat, start passing essentially voter suppression laws, right? Making it harder and harder for people of color and immigrant and others to vote. And why? Well, some argued, I remember this when I was gone, arguing, well, look, this is from the 65. How many years later are we now, right? To 50, 60 years later, things are good. Things are good. It solved it. You no longer need these, and that is clearly a problem.
So this is, I think that our knowledge of these acts to, suppress voter turnout has grown because of social media. But I remember very well, it was maybe 2003. I was in college in this little town called Seguin, and it's near San Antonio. And, they had early voting. And when we did during early voting, I could go right down the street. There was a black and Mexican American community, mostly impoverished, but down the street from us, and then you could just walk across the street to the county office. It was right there. But the day of the election, right, that poll place was closed, and I had to drive maybe 25 minutes out to the more rural area to be able to vote. And I was able to do so because I just so happened to have a car, but most people didn't have a car, and there was no bus service, right? I think I saw one taxi the whole time I was there. I think it was just this guy who just had a taxi. But that was an act of voter suppression, well before, Texas created these ID laws, right? But now what's funny about that though is So when I moved to Texas, I moved to this place called DeSoto. It has this reputation for, being this place where African Americans of privilege can buy, $300,000, $400,000 houses, right? It was very common to see, luxury cars on the road. There are certainly poor people in DeSoto, right? Don't get it twisted, but that's not the image, right? But I remember going to vote, and an African American woman was there to receive me, and she, asked for my ID, and she spouted out, right, regurgitated, right, this, right wing perspective of, we have people voting outside their district, and so we got to make sure. And I was just like, I just looked at her, I was like, they got you, sis? Like, really? Like, you really believe this? Like, who's doing that? Like who's doing that? Like, I don't know. I don't remember the political fervor in Massachusetts, but here it's just not that serious, right? I don't know anybody that's, going out their district to vote twice. Like, I just don't. And we know statistically, that the number of people that have done that is less than 1%, right? So it's like the extent to which people are going, right, to make it harder to vote, right, speaks directly to what we've seen, right, since 2008. Barack Obama did well too good a job mobilizing his base, right? He created a base, and he created a donor base, right, that was completely unheard of before that, right? He created right, these ways in which he could get to people via text message, right? And he did such a good job of creating so much knowledge and information about voting that it made it so much easier to do. And so this was an attempt to, these voter ID, ID laws, these are, changing the polling station, right? All the stuff we heard recently about the Postal Service being, overwhelmed by all the mail-in ballots, right? The attempt to stop the number of mail-in ballots, right? All these different things that we saw, right? Like, this is an attempt, right, to stop people, particularly in these urban spaces, right, from mobilizing, right? Because the prediction is these people aren't going to vote red, right? And so, but it's important to know, how long ago was it that the Supreme Court chipped away at the Voting Rights Act?
Oh, it's within the last decade. I mean, this is extraordinarily recently, like very, very recently.
And so, and then, and you're just seeing more inventive ways in which people are doing it, right? And, the film 13th by Ava DuVernay, right, which looks a lot at Michelle Alexander's research, right, where in which we can talk about, this 13th Amendment, the except for punishment of the crime clause, right, and the way in which we can use that to then disenfranchise voters, right? So disenfranchise the body politic. You go to jail, you get a felony, right? Think about the 3 strikes law, think about the war on drugs, think about increased policing, right? 3 strikes, all of that, right? In the way in which that will have an adverse effect, right, on communities of color, right, who are more likely to be, right, stopped, more likely to be, charged, more likely to be convicted, right, and then more likely
with higher sentences as well in most often
Absolutely,
cases,
yes, right, mandatory minimums and so forth, right. And so these folks, if they do get out of jail, right, they're not allowed to vote, right. Or how about this? While they're in jail, right, because like there's nothing that says that just because you committed a crime that you're no longer a citizen. Right. I think that we're still assuming a great deal by saying this is part of your punishment, right? But to the extent that we still see this, right? I think that it's important to note that.
So we have a question from Rick Greco. How do you see the relationship of events of the 1950s and television, and how do those mirror the 2010s and live streams in regard to race relations?
Oh man, I'm not gonna give you the answer you want. I don't think they do, because we lack that international context. The world's not watching us like they were in the 1950s. There's no more Cold War. So, you're gonna have these, demonstrations in Europe, right? Solidarity protests and so forth. When somebody gets choked out in the middle of the street by a police officer. But economically and politically, there's not the same. There's not as much on the line. I don't think that I don't think that I don't think there's enough of a correlation for our strategies mirroring the 1950s to overcome racism, bigotry, sexism, homophobia. I don't think our strategies are going to be as effective if we're employing the strategies of the 1950s, 60s.
Yeah,
Quite
I mean,
honestly.
and that's, people, when you had nonviolent protests, right, and all that, at first they had no idea how to deal with this, right? And so all that violence used against them was, shocking in that. But those forces also learned, how do you deal with those, right? And so the power of that has also lessened as well, right? They might not do it on camera anymore. Rick Norman makes also seemingly America doesn't care what everybody else thinks anymore, right? So as he says, we're disengaged from international concerns. I mean, so yeah, it does have less power. It is for some people, I think, who had heard this and wanted to deny it. Now they see it, and plenty of people still deny it when they see it nonetheless. So there could be the power, but yeah, I don't know. It's almost like the people are saturated with so much video too that I don't know if it resonates. So also the way our news cycles work, right? Things are here one moment, they're gone the next. It's it's unfortunate to say the least that it doesn't have the power.
I TA'd under this guy named Charlie Reynolds my first year of grad school, who had, was a huge white guy, very influential in the South, mobilized, was an ally and colleague of Dr. King. And he told me stories about these informal negotiations they would make with local police when they decided to do direct action. But nobody was going to get no protest permit, John. Like, what does it say about your protest if we have a process through the police department, right, to handle that as a transaction, right? If you have police escort, right, then what is your protest is not doing the same thing, right? The protest of the 50s and 60s was meant to disrupt, right? So we're going to cripple your transportation industry by not riding your bus, right? We're going to flood we're going to flood your jails, right? So that you can then, at least an aspect of the city government is going to be gridlocked, right? We're going to crowd downtown so that nobody can shop, right? It was meant to disrupt, right?
And now we all protest on Sundays and Saturdays when nobody's going to work. I mean, after school, it's not going to have that impact. Nobody's, you don't have to take a day off. We're not, it's almost like we're going out of our way not to upset anybody or anything like that, which is the exact opposite of what you're saying is what worked. Sorry to interject there. Yeah.
No, but do you see my point though, right? Like we're not there, we're just not there. And I think that, I don't know what the goal is. I don't know, right? I don't know what people are actually trying to do. And I don't want to speak to anybody's goals. And I certainly don't want to judge anybody's goals without knowing them. But the comparisons, I think, are superficial, quite honestly. Here's another question. Steve, who's this?
So I have a quick follow-up to that one, and then but Maria's question seems fairly straightforward. When were African-American women given the right to vote versus white women? Was it the same time? So did the 19th Amendment apply to both Black and white citizens equally?
Yes, on paper, yeah. But again, there's
Okay. So there were Black and white suffragists, male and female. African-American women were very, very involved in the suffrage movement leading to the 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920. These were primarily African-American women who were working as club women, part of club organizations, mutual aid societies, and so forth, in northern spaces.
Yeah.
Okay. What's interesting is after the ratification, these Black women from northern spaces operating as club women looked to their white counterparts and said, okay, now we should turn our attention to the South to make sure that African-Americans throughout the country will now have their freedom. This was, again, so 1920, Great Migration. Some people they say it starts in like 1914, 1915. There's evidence to support the idea that African-American was moving as early as 1895, Booker T. Washington, cast down your buckets where you are. He's speaking to that migration, right? And so African-American women are starting to enter into spaces outside of the South, 20, 25 years prior to, okay? In 1920, most Black women still live in the South though, okay? But what they're told by their white female counterpart following the ratification of the 19th Amendment is, we've accomplished our objective. we're not going to go into the South, and we've secured our vote, and we're not going to go into the South and help you with this other thing. So yeah, when did it happen? On paper, yeah, it happened at the same time. And if you were in a northern space, then you could vote, right? But it's not to say that there weren't things to disincentivize voting, but you could legally vote if you were an African American woman in the North. But the majority of African American women, just like the majority of African American men in 1920, cannot vote because they're in the South.
And then, John, you had mentioned something about the news, like our news cycles now.
Yeah. Oh, I was just saying, yeah, it was more of just, yeah, it's, I don't know if it used to be when these in the 50s, 60s and that everybody would watch their news right at the around the dinner table or at night. And so you're seeing one news cycle a day, right? So it had some more power. It's the first time it's being beamed into homes and things like that. Now it's sort of like background noise in some ways. I don't think it still has the same power. The news cycles, I mean, you have to fill it with as much, I guess, news as possible there. So I think sometimes it has a ability to get lost in there. I would even say today, I mean, it depends on what news source you're looking at. You're not going to hear any of this, right? You're not going to see this. And that's increasingly by people's choice, right? As what they want to hear, these silos or whatever we want to talk. These things are not going to be discussed everywhere or shown. Yeah, confirmation bias, exactly. And that's a problem. We've seen that recently as well.
Right. Like I've heard them called echo chambers as well.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
And it happens on both the, it happens on
both sides,
the left and the right. It does. It happens on both the left and the right. And I think that's, it's problematic. Some of the ways in which the left has evolved, right, is no more helpful. But when it comes to issues of, race equity and, social justice, economic justice, right, it's really easy for folks to just kind of tune this conversation out. Hey, real quick, I saw something that Maria said. Oh, okay, Maria, it was the convict leasing system, not common, convict leasing system.
Why did it stop? You argued that it was pressure from international allies. It was making us look bad and leading into World War II. And
leading into World War II. So around 1940, 41, 42 is when it stopped. But it was a way
that's
in
about
which
World War II with the Japanese being involved is what I think you meant, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so it was a way in which the convict leasing system, Maria read briefly, is a way for Southern, agricultural, Southern landowners as well as Southern businesses to usurp the 13th Amendment by, capitalizing on the fact that many African Americans have been imprisoned and forced into hard labor. And what it would simply do is, right, so it's one thing, right, and you've seen these old videos where the people have on stripes and they make, they're hammering big rocks into little rocks. Oh brother, where art thou? Where art thou? It's one of my favorite films where you see this, right? But that was merely one manifestation. Okay, so check this out, Maria. A person is newly freed. They've been charged. They've been, convicted. They have a fine. They can't pay it. So now they're forced to go into this jail and they have to work, right? And they're working for the state. But there are instances where business owners can come into the jail and say, hey, how much does he owe as part of his fine? Right. And the clerk might say $3, $5, $7. And they say, okay, all right, well, I'm going to pay it. And now you turn them over to me in my custody, and they will work off their fine in my care. And now it's up to their private business owner or that individual to determine how much this person's labor is worth per day and how long they have to work until they work off their sentence. Right. Now, here's the screwed up thing about this, Maria, that I think is extremely important that we need to understand. Under slavery, the body that is an African American is worth almost, right, in some cases, right, with, when you account for like, inflation, right, thousands of dollars, several thousands of dollars, okay? The body of an African American after slavery during the convict leasing system is worth whatever you would have paid them that day. So that meant, all right, under slavery, you're not having this person go work in a mine, because if the mine collapses, there's your slave, but also your
valuable money, yeah,
right? And that's why, and going back to my point before, this is why many European immigrants didn't go south, because those are the only jobs they can get, right? Where they were merely going to be paid the day that they worked, right? And so it was just too dangerous because they were exposed to the most dangerous work, right? But what you do see though, but following that, right, after slavery, during the convict leasing system, right, where the person's value was only what you would have paid them for that particular day, you don't mind exposing them to dynamite. If they blow up, go get another one. You're not, I mean, you're out of, you like their body was not protected in the same way. But anyway, I just wanted to share. I didn't want to miss that because I saw that and I didn't want her to miss that. But anyway.
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, and even though they're sometimes called the farms, right, of these giant prisons that were literally just labor camps in many ways.
Absolutely.
And they're just what's that movie Eddie Murphy does? It's it's a comedy, but it shows it. Yeah. It shows also how they just keep getting tacked on. They're you'll find Anthony and I often use movies in there because with this, but yeah, it's you see this in many of them there. It's and they still exist in some ways. I mean, you saw that in Arizona to a degree. What was it? What was that sheriff out there? But you know what I mean? But they had those too. You know, the treatment of how you want to treat prisoners. I think it was Mexican. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you could still use prisoners in this way. It's
and it's all predicated on this idea, going back to that, that caveat, right? Well, they've been convicted of a crime, and we just assume that if they've been convicted, that they must be guilty, right? And then if they're guilty of committing a crime, right, we dehumanize them. We call them convicts. We don't call them humans anymore. We call them convicts.
Numbers,
and
no names, them, numbers.
Yeah, we then, once we dehumanize them, we then allow ourselves to, to be okay or complicit with subjecting them to inhumane treatment, right? Because it's like, well, they shouldn't have done it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
And that's not just white. That's not just white folk, right? I know plenty of black folk that would say something very similar, right? The war on drugs, we need to understand both black people and white people supported it. Okay.
And then Bev Pete had a question about what can voters do to try to address some of these issues.
Yay! Thank you, Bev. So I frame my analysis of these amendments in the Civil Rights Act the way that I did, because we need to understand that the reason why, right, this descendant of Irish immigrants, right, and this descendant of African slaves is able to sit and talk to you from these positions of authority is because somebody pushed for us to be able to do this, right? There was a fight, there was a struggle, right? We need to understand the history of this country is not one that would have guaranteed us this opportunity. Okay, right? There's nothing about this that we should take for granted. The only reason why we have what we have, and the only reason why we are where we are, is because people fought for us to be here, right? Not always with their, with their fists, not always with guns, but they fought, right? And what that tells me is we must constantly be engaged in the work of fighting anti-racism, right? Gender discrimination, right? Transphobia, homophobia, right? Xenophobia. We must constantly be engaged in the work, right, of fighting, of struggling, right? And we need to understand that, yes, we can make gains. We certainly can, but those gains can be chipped away at and they can be eroded, right? And so we must be vigilant. We must do the work of educating ourselves, right? We do need to, those of you who said in the chat that we need to host more events, you're absolutely right. We definitely need to host more events like this, right? But after you get this information, right, then do something with it, right? And so, go share this with someone else, right? But then do the work of, not only participating in the body politic every 4 years, but every 2 years, right? Understand that most of what we're talking about, right, was only possible because of what was taking place at the state level. So get involved in your state level politics, right? Because that's where the change actually happens.
The best place to affect the change is local. And most people do not vote in city, town elections, things like that, state legislature, any of that. And that is it's a major problem, and it has been for a while. It really is. So what explains people just voting for every 4 years? I heard it's because it's the presidency. It has more, maybe that's our attention span for many Americans. You can only get involved in care every 4 years, or I'm not really sure. It's I mean, that's a whole other conversation too, but yeah.
I mean, but what I can tell thus far, right, and this is from talking to our students, and I did 1 year in Texas public schools, almost 1 year. I didn't last that long. I wasn't built for it. But
I lasted a day in the junior high when I was going to be secondary teacher, so you did better than me. So.
We don't teach civics in a complicated way that actually informs our citizenry. And so the most we might get is, well, yeah, every 4 years we elect a president, right? I don't think most of us are aware of the significance of midterm. Take that back. I know most of us are not aware of the significance of midterm, right? Because, Barack Obama was elected in 2008 and everybody's happy. And, I got, people telling me racism's over, right? And then 2010, dun, 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 here comes the Tea Party, right? And they are strong and they are mobilized, right? And they are really, really good if doing nothing else but making Barack Obama frustrated, right? And that is his presidency. That's the, that's as much of the legacy of his presidency as anything else, right? And so, but that happens because people are like, oh, okay, we did it, we won. And then what my argument is, going back to my answer to Bev, we can't fall asleep at the wheel. We can't ever think, okay, well, we accomplished this thing today, then we don't have anything else to do tomorrow, right? You have to always be involved, right? When we talk about the voter ID laws, right? You have people who they sit in silos and they hear what's coming on, they hear about the statistics, and they immediately get to work of trying to manipulate, right, the political law, right? They immediately get work, right, in terms of strategizing, right, spreading information, propaganda, right? And so you have to be equally involved. And yeah, it's tiring. It sure as hell is tiring. But are you going to get as fatigued as the Reconstruction Congress, right? When they're like, okay, we're just tired of this, right? Because you see where that'll take us.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, there's any gain here is, that's on the vigilance is needed, as you said. It needs to be protected. Just because you pass a law or anything like that does not mean it's just going to magically make things better. It's not the way it works. Never the way it's worked. But you're right. If civics is even taught in some places, it is taught simplistically. Many other places it's not taught, and it is. And that is an issue, to say the least. I guess any other questions? I think we went a little over time, but that's okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No. I like it. That's what we're here to do.
I miss y'all.
All these conversations.
I feel like I got 3 years to catch up for. I haven't engaged.
I know. Is there anything else, concluding things you wanted to add in, Anthony? Or I think we just did, but yeah, right. That's it.
Yeah. Thank y'all. Definitely appreciate y'all. Thank you, Rick.
Yeah, thank you, Rick, for jumping in with all this. Yeah, Vanetta as well. Thank you.
But yeah, no, it's I appreciate the opportunity to engage, and I appreciate y'all participating in the chat. And I'm glad y'all are doing this work. It's significant, and I'm glad that we can use the platform of Black history to talk about this, right? Because what I would stress, right, and this is why I got one of my PhDs, right, in this discipline. Black history is American history.
Okay. Yeah.
And there's a way in which we can talk about this that has implications for every one of us, right? Angela Davis said, if they come for me in the morning, they'll come for you at night, right? And so if we're not paying attention to what's happening to this particular realm of history, then we're more likely to be ignorant to the way in which we see, right, racial discrimination, oppression, right, as it affects other groups, right? And our STIC community is one that is representative of many different, right, socioeconomic statuses, ethnic, ethnicities, right, nationalities, right, orientations, religions. We got to protect everybody, y'all. We can't ever.
None of this is separate. It all works together.
Yeah. No, it's all interrelated, right? All these things are our concept of race law, right, is predicated on, right, the racial caste system created by slavery. Right, the way in which other groups would then be would fit into the country, right?
Right. At one point, the law in the country was white and black. Those are the only two races. White was from Europe. Everybody else was black. You had people from Asia, Japan, India challenging these laws. They're like, well, you're not from Western Europe. So, and that was, again, based on slavery and things like that. It's
absolutely. We did this talk on, we showed this movie, The Borinqueneers, that looked at Puerto Ricans who fought during World War I, right?
Yes.
It's because of American race law and the racial caste system that those particular groups of Puerto Ricans were chosen to fight.
Yes. Yeah.
We need to understand that. They looked a certain way.
Very light skinned. Yes, exactly. Yeah, that wasn't an accident. You see those pictures, right? They all,
Absolutely. It's because we needed bodies, but we did not want to have African Americans fight. And so Puerto Rico was, Puerto Rico was our target, and very fair-skinned Puerto Ricans were chosen for that purpose. So we need to understand that this stuff is connected. And like I said, there's a way in which we can do this that's not merely talking about contributionists, George Washington Carver and his peanut and all of that. We can do something where I know, don't pay me attention.
Sorry.
I'm sorry. But there's a way in which we could do this, right? Where we could talk about implications that affect all of us. And I think that's why we need to talk about this.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Okay.
Well,
that's all I have.
Thank you. Yeah. No, thank you. It's great. I miss our conversations like this. I really do. This is, really do.
Yeah, what y'all don't know is we used to sit in our offices late in the afternoon and we used to have these talks. So, yeah. Y'all could have just been hanging out with us this whole time.
Yeah. It's great.
Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you, John, for helping too. John Reynolds.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Okay. All right, guys.
And thank you, Steve, for doing this, especially at short notice too. Steve jumped in as a moderator. Not even 24 hours ago. So thank you.
Rick Greco, thank you for your vision. Thank you for your continued support. Since you've taken the helm, you've been doing great things over there, and I appreciate that. I look forward to continued opportunities to engage.
I agree.
So,
thank you.
All right.
All right. Okay, thank you, everybody.
All right.
All right. Love y'all.
Yes.
All right. Y'all take care.
Andy, I'll talk to you. Good.
Okay, now.
All right.